The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside Bay Ridge High School as a 15-year-old sophomore sat hunched over his advanced physics test, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. He had always been the kind of student who double-checked his work, who raised his hand when something didn't add up. Today would prove no different, except this time, his attention to detail would turn his life upside down. The test question seemed simple enough at first glance, a standard calculation about acceleration and velocity. But as he worked through the problem, something felt off. The given values didn't match up with the possible answers. He rechecked his calculations 3 times, each time arriving at the same conclusion: there was definitely an error in the test. Most students would have shrugged it off, picked the closest answer, and moved on. But this young man had been raised by a single mom who worked as an accountant, and she had always taught him that integrity meant speaking up, even when it was uncomfortable. With 10 minutes left in the period, he raised his hand. Yes, his physics teacher, Mr. Chen, approached his desk. "Sir, I think there might be a mistake in question 14, the student whispered, not wanting to disturb his classmates. "The initial velocity value doesn't align with the possible answers. I've checked it multiple times." Mr. Chen's expression darkened. He had been teaching for 20 years, and like many veteran teachers, he didn't appreciate having his work questioned, especially not in front of the class. "Just complete the test with the information provided," he said curtly before walking away. But the student couldn't let it go. After class, he approached Mr. Chen's desk with his rough calculations scribbled on a separate piece of paper. "Sir, I can show you my work. If we use the given initial velocity of 15 meters per second. Enough." Mr. Chen's voice carried across the now empty classroom. "Your constant questioning is becoming disruptive. I've told you to work with what's provided." That evening, the student spent hours researching the problem, verifying his calculations against his textbook and online physics resources. His mom found him still awake at midnight, surrounded by papers covered in equations. "What's keeping you up so late?" she asked, concerned about the dark circles under her son's eyes. He explained the situation, showing her his work. His mom listened carefully, her accountant's mind following his logical reasoning. "You're sure about this?" she asked finally. 100%, he replied. "And it's not just about getting the right answer. What about the other students who might lose points because of this? It's not fair to anyone." The next day, armed with his thoroughly documented proof and his mother's encouragement, he decided to take his concerns to the head of the science department. He had no idea that this decision would set off a chain of events that would affect not just his own future, but the entire school's approach to student advocacy. What he didn't expect was the response he received. Instead of addressing the test error, the administration accused him of challenging authority and disrupting the educational process. By the end of the day, he found himself sitting in the principal's office, facing a 5-day suspension for insubordination causing disruption to the learning environment. His mother was called in from work, her face a mix of concern and disbelief as the principal explained the situation. The student sat quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he held onto his folder of calculations and research, evidence that now seemed useless in the face of administrative authority. As they walked to the car, his mother's heels clicking sharply against the pavement, neither of them spoke. The weight of injustice hung heavy in the air. But sometimes, when systems fail us, unexpected allies emerge from the most surprising places. And for this student, the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. That evening, as news of his suspension spread through student group chats and social media, something unexpected began to take shape. His classmates, many of whom had struggled with the same test question but had remained silent, started speaking up. They had witnessed his persistent yet respectful approach to addressing the issue, and his suspension struck a chord with many of them. The student lay in his bed that night, staring at his ceiling, wondering if standing up for what he believed was right had been worth it. Little did he know that while he questioned his actions, a movement was building that would challenge the very foundations of how student voices were heard and respected in their school system. The morning after his suspension, the student's phone buzzed continuously with messages of support from classmates. But it was one particular message that caught his attention. It came from Mrs. Kumar, a retired physics teacher who had taught at Bay Ridge High for over 3 decades before retiring the previous year. She had heard about the incident from her former colleagues and wanted to meet with him. That afternoon, sitting in a local coffee shop with his mother and Mrs. Kumar, the student spread out his calculations once again. The retired teacher adjusted her reading glasses, methodically going through each step of his work. The coffee shop's gentle buzz of conversation filled the background as she examined the problem. "This is exemplary work," she finally said, looking up from the papers. "Not just the calculations, but the thoroughness of your documentation. You're absolutely correct about the error." She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "But there's something else you should know. This isn't the first time something like this has happened at Bay Ridge." Mrs. Kumar revealed that over the years, she had witnessed numerous instances where student concerns were dismissed, particularly when they challenged authority figures. She had tried to advocate for change from within the system but had faced resistance from administration who prioritized maintaining their authority over addressing valid student concerns. "The difference now," she said, her eyes twinkling, "is that students have platforms to make their voices heard. And you have evidence." As if on cue, the student's phone buzzed again. One of his classmates had started an online petition demanding the school review the suspension and address the test error. It had already gathered hundreds of signatures, not just from students but from parents and community members as well. The local education blog picked up the story next. The headline read, "Honor Student Suspended for Identifying Test Error, a Question of Academic Integrity." The article detailed how the student had followed proper channels, attempting to address the issue professionally before being punished for his persistence. The school board's inbox began filling with emails from concerned citizens. Parents started questioning whether their own children's academic concerns were being properly addressed. The story touched a nerve in the community, highlighting a broader issue about student advocacy and administrative accountability. Back at Bay Ridge High, something remarkable was happening. Students began documenting other instances where their legitimate academic concerns had been dismissed. A pattern emerged, one that suggested a systemic problem in how the school handled student feedback. The student's physics classmates had begun independently verifying his calculations. They created a shared document showing their work, each reaching the same conclusion he had. Some even found additional minor errors in other test questions that they had previously been too intimidated to mention. Mr. Chen, meanwhile, maintained his stance that the suspension was about insubordination, not the test question itself. But when 3 other physics teachers from neighboring schools reviewed the test and confirmed the error, his position became increasingly difficult to defend. By the 4th day of the suspension, the story had caught the attention of the district superintendent's office. What had started as a simple question about a physics problem had evolved into a debate about student rights, academic integrity, and the importance of creating an environment where students felt safe pointing out mistakes. The student's mother had been his rock throughout the ordeal. Every evening, they sat at their kitchen table, reviewing emails from supporters and discussing next steps. She had taken time off work to help him navigate the situation, drawing on her accounting experience to help him organize the growing documentation of support for his case. "Remember," she told him one evening, "this isn't just about one test question anymore. It's about making sure every student feels heard when they speak up respectfully." The online petition had reached over 2,000 signatures. Former Bay Ridge graduates began sharing their own stories of times they had noticed errors but stayed silent out of fear of repercussions. The hashtag Listen to Students started trending locally on social media. Mrs. Kumar helped coordinate a group of retired teachers who wrote a joint letter to the school board, emphasizing the importance of fostering critical thinking and supporting students who demonstrate academic diligence. Their letter pointed out that in the real world, the ability to identify and professionally address errors is a valuable skill that should be encouraged, not punished. The student's younger sister, a middle school student, proudly told him how his story was being discussed in her classes. Teachers were using it as an example of civic engagement and the importance of standing up for what's right in a respectful way. As the fifth and final day of his suspension approached, the pressure on the school administration had become impossible to ignore. The superintendent's office announced they would be conducting a formal review of both the test question and the suspension decision. The student spent that evening helping his mom prepare dinner, trying to process everything that had happened. The simple act of chopping vegetables and measuring ingredients, precise actions with predictable results, felt comforting after days of uncertainty. "I never expected any of this," he told his mother as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "I just wanted to fix a math problem." She smiled, squeezing his shoulder. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. You stood up for what was right, and you did it the right way. That's what matters. As he went to bed that night, his phone lit up with one final message, this one from a local university's physics department. They had been following the story and wanted to invite him to visit their advanced research lab. Perhaps, they suggested, there was a silver lining to this whole situation. The student fell asleep thinking about how a single physics problem had set off a chain reaction that was still unfolding. Tomorrow would bring the end of his suspension, but it was becoming clear that the ripple effects of his stand for academic integrity were just beginning. The morning of his return to school arrived with a mix of fog and early sunshine. The student adjusted his backpack straps as he walked up the familiar steps of Bay Ridge High, his heart beating a little faster than usual. The past 5 days had transformed from a punishment into something much bigger than himself. As he pushed open the heavy front doors, he noticed something different in the atmosphere. Students he barely knew nodded at him in the hallways. A freshman gave him a thumbs up. Even the usually stern-faced hall monitor cracked a small smile. The message was clear, his stand had resonated with people in ways he hadn't anticipated. His first class of the day wasn't physics, it was English literature. As he slipped into his usual seat, his English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was writing on the board, the role of individual voice in creating institutional change. She turned to the class with a knowing smile. Without directly mentioning recent events, she led a discussion about historical figures who had challenged established systems through peaceful means. During lunch period, he found his usual table crowded with more students than ever before. They shared stories about times they had noticed problems but stayed quiet. A junior talked about a clear error in last year's chemistry textbook that no one had dared to point out. 2 seniors discussed how they had recently started a study group to double-check their work and support each other in addressing academic concerns. The atmosphere in the cafeteria hummed with an energy of change. Students from different grades and social groups were mixing, united by a common cause. The lunch ladies even gave him an extra helping of mashed potatoes with a wink. But the real test would come in 6th period, physics class. As he approached Mr. Chen's classroom, he felt a knot in his stomach. The superintendent's investigation was still ongoing, and he hadn't seen his physics teacher since the suspension. Walking into the classroom, he found Mr. Chen writing equations on the board. The teacher paused briefly as he entered, their eyes meeting for a moment. The tension in the room was palpable. Other students watched discreetly, wondering how this would play out. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Chen cleared his throat and addressed the class. "Before we begin today's lesson, I want to acknowledge something. Teaching science isn't just about memorizing formulas, it's about developing critical thinking skills and attention to detail. Sometimes those skills reveal mistakes we ourselves have made." The class sat in stunned silence as Mr. Chen continued, "The test question has been reviewed, and there was indeed an error in the given values. All students will receive full credit for that question, and we will be reviewing the correct solution today. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a start. The student felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he opened his notebook. In that moment, he realized that change doesn't always come as a dramatic revolution. Sometimes it arrives in small acknowledgments and subtle shifts in perspective. After school, he was called to the principal's office, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The superintendent herself was there, along with his mother and Mrs. Kumar. The meeting lasted over an hour as they discussed not just his specific case, but broader issues about student advocacy and academic integrity. Your actions, the superintendent said, have sparked an important conversation in our district. We're implementing new guidelines for how student academic concerns should be addressed. She slid a document across the desk. It was a draft of the new policy, and they wanted his input. The policy outlined clear steps for students to raise academic concerns, established time frames for reviewing such concerns, and explicitly protected students from retaliation for raising valid issues. It would be named the Academic Integrity and Student Voice Initiative. But the superintendent wasn't finished. We're also forming a student-faculty academic review board, she announced. We'd like you to be one of the founding student members. The board would meet monthly to discuss academic concerns and ensure open communication between students and faculty. As they left the office, his mother squeezed his hand, the same way she had when he was little and had done something that made her proud. Mrs. Kumar beamed like a grandmother at a graduation ceremony. The education conference was held in a grand hotel downtown, its marble lobby filled with educators, administrators, and education reform advocates from across the country. The student stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His mother had helped him pick out the suit, his first one, the weekend before. Just remember, Mrs. Kumar had told him during their preparation sessions, speak from your heart. Your story is powerful because it's real. She had spent hours helping him organize his thoughts, turning his experience into a message that could inspire others. As he waited to be introduced, he thought about how much had changed in the past month. The Student-Faculty Academic Review Board had already held its first meeting, addressing not just test-related concerns but broader academic issues. Students were finding their voices in ways that surprised everyone. The conference moderator's voice broke through his thoughts. Our next speaker showed us that sometimes the most important lessons in education come from the students themselves. Walking onto the stage, he saw his mother in the front row, sitting between Mrs. Kumar and his sister. Mr. Chen had also come, something nobody had expected. The physics teacher had undergone his own transformation, becoming an advocate for open dialogue between students and faculty. A month ago, he began, his voice steadied despite his nerves, I was just a student who noticed a math error. Today, I want to talk about what happens when we create spaces where students feel safe speaking up, and where teachers feel secure enough to acknowledge mistakes. He shared how the initial confrontation had transformed into collaboration. How what started as a suspension had sparked a movement. The audience leaned forward as he described the changes at Bay Ridge High, not just in policy, but in culture. We're seeing students who used to stay quiet now raising their hands, he explained. Teachers are sharing their own stories of learning from mistakes. Last week, a freshman pointed out an error in a geometry worksheet, and you know what happened? The teacher thanked her in front of the entire class. During the Q&A session, administrators from other districts asked about implementing similar programs in their schools. A teacher from a small rural school shared how she'd been inspired to start a student advocacy group after reading about Bay Ridge's story online. But it was a question from a student in the audience that really struck home. Weren't you scared? How did you find the courage to keep pushing and the adults in charge were against you? He thought for a moment before answering. Of course I was scared. But my mom always taught me that doing the right thing isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. And honestly, the support I received from classmates, teachers like Mrs. Kumar, and eventually even from those who initially opposed me, showed me that standing up for truth brings out the best in everyone. After the conference, something unexpected happened. Schools across the state began reaching out to Bay Ridge High, asking if their student leaders could visit and learn from their experience. The superintendent, seeing an opportunity, organized a student leadership summit. Back at school, the changes were becoming more apparent each day. The Student Faculty Academic Review Board had created subcommittees focusing on different subjects. Students were volunteering to help review teaching materials before they were distributed, catching potential errors early and suggesting improvements. Mr. Chen, in a surprising turn of events, had become one of the most vocal supporters of the new system. In 30 years of teaching, he told a local education reporter, "I've never seen students so engaged with their own education. They're not just learning physics, they're learning how to think critically and advocate for themselves professionally." The student sister had started a similar initiative in her middle school, adapting the high school's program for younger students. "My brother showed me that age doesn't matter when it comes to making things better," she told her classmates during a presentation. One afternoon, as he helped organize files for the review board, he found his original physics test calculations buried under newer documents. Looking at those pencil marks, he remembered the late night when he'd worked through the problem over and over, never imagining where it would lead. His phone buzzed with a message from the university physics department. They were offering summer internships to high school students, and they specifically wanted him to apply. "Your dedication to academic integrity and your ability to effect positive change are exactly what we look for in future scientists," the email read. That evening, during dinner, his mother surprised him with a scrapbook she'd been keeping. It contained everything from the original test question to newspaper clippings, photos from the conference, and letters of support from the community. On the last page was a quote she'd written, "Never doubt that a single question, asked with courage and conviction, can change the world." The changes weren't limited to academics. Students were becoming more involved in other aspects of school governance. The Student Council was working with administration to revise outdated policies. A peer mentoring program had started, pairing upperclassmen with freshmen to help them navigate academic challenges. Mrs. Kumar, who had initially come out of retirement just to help him prepare for the conference, was now consulting with other schools about implementing similar programs. "What happened at Bay Ridge High isn't just about one test or one student," she told a group of educators. "It's about creating an educational environment where everyone, students and teachers alike, feels empowered to contribute to the learning process." As the semester progressed, the student found himself reflecting on how a single moment of standing up for what he believed in had created such far-reaching changes. The suspension that was meant to silence him had instead amplified not just his voice, but the voices of students everywhere. One day, a freshman stopped him in the hallway. "I just wanted to say thanks," the younger student said. "Yesterday I found a mistake in my biology homework, and I wasn't afraid to bring it up. The teacher actually gave me extra credit for my attention to detail." These small moments, he realized, were perhaps the most meaningful results of everything that had happened. It wasn't just about fixing errors in tests or changing policies, it was about creating an environment where everyone felt valued and heard. 3 months had passed since the physics test incident, and Bay Ridge High was preparing for its first-ever student-led educational summit. The main hallway buzzed with activity as students hung banners and arranged chairs in the auditorium. Representatives from 20 different schools across the state would be attending. The student who had started it all stood at the podium, doing a sound check. He couldn't help but smile at how the simple act of questioning one test problem had snowballed into something so much bigger. His sister sat in the back row, taking notes for her middle school's upcoming implementation of their own student advocacy program. "Testing, testing," his voice echoed through the speakers. Behind him, a large screen displayed the summit's theme, "Building Bridges, Students and Teachers Working Together." The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the same auditorium where he'd received his suspension notice was now hosting an event celebrating student advocacy. Mr. Chen appeared at the side entrance, carrying a stack of handouts. The physics teacher had undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. After initially resisting change, he had become one of the program's strongest advocates, even creating a template for how teachers could better handle student feedback. "Ready for tomorrow?" Mr. Chen asked, setting down the papers. "I never thought I'd say this, but your questioning that test was one of the best things that could have happened to our school." The student thought back to that nerve-wracking day when he'd first raised his hand to point out the error. "I never imagined it would lead to all this," he gestured at the preparations around them. During lunch break, he sat with his original physics classmates, now dubbed the Catalyst Crew by younger students. They had become informal mentors to others learning to advocate for themselves. The cafeteria, once strictly divided by grade levels and social groups, had become a place where students freely mixed and discussed ideas for school improvement. His mother had taken the afternoon off work to help with summit preparations. As she arranged name tags at the registration table, she overheard two teachers from another school discussing how the Bay Ridge model had influenced their own teaching methods. "Since implementing similar policies, our student participation has increased by 40%, one teacher said. Kids who never spoke up before are now actively engaging in class discussions." The local education board had taken notice too. They were using Bay Ridge's experience to develop district-wide guidelines for student advocacy. The superintendent had even been invited to speak at a national education conference about the transformation of their school culture. Mrs. Kumar, who had become something of a grandmother figure to many students involved in the program, sat in her usual spot in the library, helping a group of freshmen prepare their presentation for tomorrow. "Remember," she told them, "every big change starts with someone willing to speak up." That evening, during the final preparation meeting, the student received an unexpected email. The State Department of Education wanted to feature Bay Ridge's story in their upcoming curriculum about civic engagement and student leadership. They were particularly interested in how one student's stand for academic integrity had created a ripple effect throughout the entire education system. As he walked home that evening, he passed the coffee shop where he and Mrs. Kumar had first reviewed his calculations. It had become an unofficial meeting spot for the Student-Faculty Academic Review Board, its corner table often occupied by students and teachers working together to solve problems. His sister rushed up behind him, excited to share news from her middle school. "Guess what? 3 other middle schools want to start programs like ours. They're sending representatives to tomorrow's summit." At home, his mother was preparing dinner while reviewing the summit schedule. The kitchen counter was covered with pamphlets titled "Speaking Up, Speaking Out: A Guide to Student Advocacy." The guide, co-authored by students and teachers from Bay Ridge, was being distributed to schools across the state. "You know what makes me proudest?" his mother said, stirring the pasta sauce. "Not just that you stood up for what was right, but how you helped create a system where others could do the same." The next morning, as students and educators from different schools filled the auditorium, there was a palpable sense of excitement. The registration table ran out of name tags twice. Extra chairs had to be brought in to accommodate unexpected attendees. During his opening speech, the student shared something he hadn't told anyone before. "The night before I decided to question that test problem, I almost convinced myself to let it go. It seemed easier to stay quiet. But then I thought about future students who might face the same situation. Sometimes, making things better for others means being willing to face uncomfortable moments ourselves." The summit included workshops on effective communication between students and teachers, panels on implementing student advocacy programs, and discussions about creating supportive learning environments. But the most powerful moments came during the open sharing session, where students from different schools told their own stories of finding their voices. A quiet sophomore from a neighboring district described how Bay Ridge's example had given her the courage to start a peer tutoring program at her school. A teacher admitted that allowing students to question his work had actually made him a better educator. Mr. Chen's presentation on Transform teacher-student relationships received a standing ovation. He shared how his initial resistance to being questioned had come from a place of insecurity, and how embracing student feedback had reinvigorated his passion for teaching. As the summit drew to a close, participants weren't just leaving with new ideas and strategies, they were leaving with a new vision of what education could be. A place where questions were welcomed, where mistakes were seen as opportunities for growth, and where every voice mattered. The students stood at the entrance, saying goodbye to attendees. A small group of freshmen from another school approached him. "We've been too scared to speak up about problems at our school," one of them admitted. "But after today, we're going to try. You showed us it's possible." Looking around at the impact of his actions, he realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest questions. What had begun as a simple calculation error had transformed into a movement that was reshaping how students and teachers interacted, not just at Bay Ridge, but beyond. 6 months after the summit, Bay Ridge High had become a model for educational reform. The state's largest newspaper ran a feature story titled, "How One Student's Question Revolutionized Education." But the real changes were happening in the quiet moments, in classrooms and hallways across the district. On a crisp autumn morning, the students sat in on a district board meeting, watching as representatives from 30 schools presented their implementation plans for student advocacy programs. Each school had adapted Bay Ridge's model to fit their unique needs, but the core principle remained the same: creating spaces where students felt empowered to speak up. His phone buzzed with a message from a student in a neighboring state. Their school board had just approved a similar program, inspired by Bay Ridge's success. These messages had become common, students reaching out for advice, sharing their own stories of finding their voices. The original physics classroom had been transformed into what students now called the Innovation Lab. One wall displayed the famous test question, framed alongside news clippings and photos documenting the journey. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Every breakthrough begins with a question." Mr. Chen had been promoted to head of the science department, where he implemented a revolutionary peer review system. Students and teachers worked together to review teaching materials before they were used in class. The result? A 70% reduction in errors and a significant increase in student engagement. During lunch periods, the cafeteria now hosted open forum Fridays, where students could raise concerns or suggest improvements. The administration had discovered that some of their best policy changes came from these informal discussions. Last week, a sophomore's suggestion about restructuring study hall had led to a more efficient system that the whole school had adopted. The student's sister had become a leader in her own right. Her middle school's advocacy program had spread to the elementary level, where even the youngest students were learning the importance of respectful questioning and critical thinking. His mother had been invited to speak at parent-teacher conferences across the district, sharing her perspective on supporting children who speak up for what's right. The key, she would tell parents, is teaching them the difference between questioning authority and questioning ideas. One tears down, the other builds up. Mrs. Kumar had come out of retirement permanently, taking on a new role as student advocacy coordinator for the district. Her office became a hub for students and teachers seeking guidance on implementing change in their schools. Every day, she told visitors, "I see the power of what happens when we listen to our students." The university physics department had made good on their internship offer, but with a twist. They created a special program combining scientific research with educational reform, allowing high school students to develop both their academic and leadership skills. One morning, as the student helped a group of freshmen prepare for their first academic review board presentation, he overheard something that made him smile. A young student was explaining to her friend, "You know, before all this happened, people thought speaking up about problems would get them in trouble. Now it's just normal. The state education department had taken notice. They were developing a comprehensive guide based on Bay Ridge's experience, titled Building Bridges, a framework for student-teacher collaboration. Schools across the country had begun requesting copies even before publication. Mr. Chen's physics class had evolved too. Now, when students spotted potential errors, they didn't just raise their hands, they led class discussions about different approaches to solving the problem. These discussions often led to deeper understanding of the subject matter than the original lesson plan. During a district-wide teacher training session, the superintendent shared some remarkable statistics. Schools that had implemented student advocacy programs showed improved academic performance, higher attendance rates, and significantly better student satisfaction scores. But more importantly, they reported a cultural shift. Students were more engaged, more confident, and more invested in their education. The original Student-Faculty Academic Review Board had expanded into multiple specialized committees, each focusing on different aspects of school improvement. Students who had once been labeled troublemakers for questioning the system were now leading these committees, turning their critical thinking skills into positive change. One afternoon, as he walked through the school library, the student noticed something different. The traditionally quiet space was filled with small groups of students and teachers, engaged in animated but respectful discussions about everything from curriculum improvements to cafeteria menu suggestions. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined school relationships had evolved into genuine collaboration. His mother found him that evening in his room, surrounded by letters from students across the country. "Reading these reminds me of where we started," he told her. Each one has a similar story. They saw something that could be better, but they were afraid to speak up. Now they're not afraid anymore. The impact extended beyond academics. Local businesses had started reaching out to Bay Ridge graduates, specifically seeking students who had been involved in the advocacy program. These students know how to identify problems and propose solutions professionally, one employer explained. "That's exactly what we need in the workplace." As the semester drew to a close, the student received an unexpected invitation. A major educational conference wanted him to keynote their annual meeting, not to talk about the physics test anymore, but to discuss how student advocacy had evolved into a movement for educational reform. Standing in front of his bedroom mirror, practicing his speech, he reflected on how much had changed. The nervous sophomore who had double-checked his calculations late into the night had grown into someone who helped others find their voices. But more importantly, he had helped create a system where future students wouldn't have to choose between speaking up and staying safe. The National Education Conference was held in the state capitol, drawing educators and administrators from all 50 states. The student stood at the center of the main stage, no longer the nervous sophomore who had questioned a physics test. Now a senior, he had become a symbol of educational reform. "A year ago," he began, addressing the packed auditorium, "we thought we were fixing one test question. Instead, we ended up reimagining how students and teachers could work together." The audience, filled with educators, policy makers, and student representatives, listened intently as he shared how Bay Ridge's transformation had sparked a national movement. The Department of Education had just released a groundbreaking report. Schools that adopted student advocacy programs showed a 40% increase in student engagement, a 35% improvement in academic performance, and most importantly, a 60% rise in students reporting they felt heard and valued in their educational environment. During the conference's main panel discussion, superintendents from across the country shared their experiences implementing similar programs. A school district in the Midwest had adapted Bay Ridge's model for rural schools with limited resources. An inner-city school system had modified it to address unique urban challenges. Mr. Chen, now a regular speaker at educational conferences, presented research showing how embracing student feedback had improved teaching quality across all subjects. When we stopped seeing questions as challenges to authority and started seeing them as opportunities for growth, he explained, everything changed. Back at Bay Ridge, the changes had become deeply embedded in the school's culture. New students arrived having heard about the school's reputation for student empowerment. The original student-faculty academic review board had evolved into a comprehensive system of collaborative governance that other schools used as a template. His sister's middle school program had caught the attention of educational researchers. They were studying how early exposure to respectful advocacy affected student development. Preliminary results showed significant improvements in critical thinking skills and social confidence among participating students. Mrs. Kumar had been appointed to a national task force on educational reform. Her experience bridging the gap between traditional teaching methods and modern student advocacy made her invaluable in developing new educational standards. "We're not just changing policies," she would say, "we're changing mindsets." The student's mother had started a parent support network, helping families understand how to encourage their children's advocacy while maintaining respect for education. The network had spread to hundreds of schools across the country, creating a community of parents committed to fostering positive change. One evening, after another successful academic review board meeting, the student found himself in the physics classroom where it all began. The famous test question, now preserved behind glass, had become a teaching tool. Teachers used it to demonstrate not just physics principles, but the importance of questioning and verification. The university physics department's special program had expanded to include students from across the state. They had created a curriculum that combined scientific rigor with leadership development, preparing students for a future where technical skills and advocacy went hand in hand. During lunch periods, the cafeteria buzzed with a different kind of energy. Students from various grades sat together, discussing everything from curriculum improvements to community outreach programs. The hierarchical barriers that once divided the school community had dissolved, replaced by a culture of collaboration. The state education department's guide, Building Bridges, had become required reading in teacher training programs nationwide. Educational consultants studied the Bay Ridge model, analyzing how a single student stand for academic integrity had catalyzed systemic change. As graduation approached, the student received news that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Several top universities had offered him scholarships, not just for his academic achievements, but for his role in educational reform. They saw him as someone who could help shape the future of education. His physics classmates, the original Catalyst crew, had all found their own paths in the advocacy movement. Some focused on academic reform, others on student rights, but all carried forward the lesson that one voice, raised respectfully but persistently, could create lasting change. The local business community had taken notice too. They started an internship program specifically for students involved in advocacy work, recognizing that the skills developed through respectful questioning and problem-solving were valuable in the professional world. One afternoon, as he helped a group of freshmen prepare for their first presentation to the school board, he overheard something that made all the challenges worthwhile. A young student was explaining to her nervous classmate, "Remember, they want to hear what we have to say. That's how things get better for everyone." The movement had spread beyond academics. Students were applying the principles of respectful advocacy to community issues, environmental concerns, and social justice. They had learned that change wasn't about confrontation, it was about collaboration, persistence, and the courage to speak up. As he prepared to graduate, the student reflected on the legacy he would leave behind. The physics test that had once seemed like a crisis had become a catalyst for transformation. But the real achievement wasn't in the policies or programs, it was in the countless students who now felt empowered to speak up, to question, to contribute to their own education. Graduation day at Bay Ridge High School dawned bright and clear. The student adjusted his cap and gown, touching the gold honor cord that symbolized academic excellence and the blue cord that had been created specially for students who had contributed to educational reform. The graduation ceremony itself reflected how much had changed. Instead of a traditional valedictorian speech, students from different grades shared stories of transformation. The superintendent announced that over 500 schools nationwide had now adopted programs based on Bay Ridge's model. His mother sat in the audience, tears in her eyes, remembering the night they had sat at their kitchen table, reviewing those physics calculations. Mrs. Kumar, now retired again but still mentoring student advocates, sat beside her. Mr. Chen stood at the side of the stage, no longer the rigid authority figure he had once been, but a proud mentor. The ceremony included a surprise announcement. The state legislature had passed the Student Voice Act, ensuring that every school in the state would implement student advocacy programs. Bay Ridge's experience had proven that when students felt empowered to speak up respectfully, everyone benefited. During his graduation speech, the student shared something he'd never told anyone. The hardest part wasn't finding the error in that physics test, he revealed. It was finding the courage to speak up when it seemed easier to stay quiet. But that moment taught me that sometimes our biggest fears lead to our greatest achievements. The audience included educators from across the country, studying Bay Ridge's transformation. They had come to see how a simple question about a physics problem had sparked a revolution in education. What they found was more than just new policies, they found a complete shift in how students and teachers interacted. His sister, now in high school herself, had already been elected to lead next year's Student-Faculty Academic Review Board. The program she started in middle school had spread to elementary schools throughout the district, teaching even the youngest students the value of respectful advocacy. After the ceremony, families gathered in the school courtyard, where a new monument had been unveiled. It wasn't grand or imposing, just a simple plaque with the words, "Every voice matters. Every question counts." Below it, the original physics problem was engraved, a reminder of how small moments can lead to big changes. The local news covered the graduation, but they focused on something unexpected. Instead of highlighting the student who had started it all, they interviewed dozens of others who had found their voices through the program. Each had a different story, but the same message: speaking up had changed their lives. Universities across the country had taken notice. They weren't just offering scholarships, they were redesigning their education programs to incorporate lessons from Bay Ridge's experience. Future teachers were learning how to create environments where questions were welcomed and critical thinking was celebrated. The student's college acceptance letter had come with an unusual offer. Besides studying physics, he would help develop programs to encourage student advocacy in higher education. The university saw him not just as a student, but as someone who could help shape the future of education. Mr. Chen had one final surprise. He had rewritten his entire physics curriculum, incorporating student feedback and collaborative problem solving. The new approach was being adopted by schools nationwide, proving that when teachers and students worked together, everyone learned more effectively. The graduation reception included students from other schools who had started their own advocacy programs. They shared stories of initial resistance, eventual acceptance, and final transformation. Each school had faced unique challenges, but all had discovered the same truth, that respectful questioning led to positive change. His mother's parent support network had grown into a national organization, helping families understand how to support children who spoke up for what was right. They offered resources, guidance, and most importantly, a community of parents committed to fostering positive change in education. As the day drew to a close, the student visited his old physics classroom one last time. The room had been transformed into a space where questions were encouraged and mistakes were seen as opportunities for learning. On the wall, alongside the famous test question, hung pictures of students who had found their voices through the program. Looking back, he realized that the suspension that had seemed like a punishment had actually been the beginning of something remarkable. It had taught him, and countless others, that sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the curriculum. The legacy he left behind wasn't just in the policies or programs that had been created. It was in the freshmen who now felt confident asking questions in class. It was in the teachers who saw student feedback as valuable input rather than criticism. It was in the culture of collaboration that had replaced the old hierarchy. As he walked out of Bay Ridge High School for the last time as a student, he passed a group of middle schoolers touring the campus. One of them was reading the plaque about the physics test incident. "Can you imagine?" she asked her friends. "One person really can change things." He smiled, knowing that the real story wasn't about one person at all. It was about what happened when people discovered their voices and used them to make things better for everyone. The physics test that had started it all was just the first question in a conversation that would continue long after he graduated.